Welcome back to The Closing Advantage. Real property, real people, real stories, real consequences. Where relationships matter, knowledge wins, and professionals learn how to own their deals from contract to closing. My name is Bill O'Connell, and I am your host. Today, we are continuing our journey through the title insurance policy with real stories. I've come to call this series The Foundation. That's because the title insurance policy is the foundation of every real estate transaction. It is the grease that keeps the wheels of commerce moving. Today's episode is about something buyers assume is simple until it isn't: getting to the house. Not title in the abstract, not legal jargon in a vacuum, not some ancient defect buried in a dusty book, just access. Can you actually get to the home the way you thought you could when you bought it? Because in this story, a married couple bought a beautiful home, obtained a owner's policy, and later found themselves in a bitter fight with their neighbors over a shared driveway. What followed was years of litigation, a coverage dispute, and a sharp lesson in the difference between practical access and legal access. Remember, like all of my real stories, the names have been changed to protect the innocent. The story begins with Andrew and Melissa Wilson purchasing a home that felt like a step up in every sense. Quiet setting, a little privacy, a property that felt established and substantial. They were not scraping together every dollar to close, but they were thoughtful buyers. They wanted to do things correctly, and they understood that buying a home is not just about the structure, it's about the rights that come with it. So at closing, they purchased an owner's insurance policy, not because they expected a fight, but because they wanted certainty. At that moment, nothing appeared unusual. The house was there, the lot was there, the driveway was there, the route in and out looked obvious. Like most buyers, they saw access with their eyes and assumed that the law matched what they could see. For a while, life moved on. Then came the dispute with the neighbor we'll call Smith. The property and Smith's property, what we call flag lots. Think of a flag blowing in the wind with the pole as the access to the public road. Now, the two lots were mirror images of each other, and they shared a common boundary right down the middle of the pole. But the driveway that was used to reach each home was on Smith's section of the pole. The developer put the utilities down the Wilson section of the pole. Eventually, Smith got upset with the Wilsons over some maintenance issues and asserted that the Wilsons had no right to use the driveway on Smith's property. The conflict escalated, obstacles were placed. In fact, Smith installed a split rail fence right down the property line, so now Wilson couldn't get to his property. Litigation ensued. Now, from the homeowner's point of view, this felt like an access problem, period. They bought a home with a real driveway, they used it, the neighbors blocked it, and there was a legal fight. So they turned to the title insurer and said, in substance, this is exactly why we bought the policy. Okay, so now let's stop here for a minute. As you know, there's two kinds of owner's policies. Under the Alta owner's policy, which we also call the standard policy, it contains covered risk number 4. And covered risk number 4 covers loss or damage caused by, quote, no right of access to and from the land. Now, under the Alta homeowner's policy, the analogous provision is in covered risk 11, which says you do not have actual vehicular and pedestrian access to and from the land based on a legal right. That distinction matters. The standard policy covers a legal right of access. The homeowner's policy covers actual vehicular and pedestrian access based on a legal right. Now, that sounds subtle, but in claims, it's not subtle at all. I once tried to explain the difference in another claim where the owner accessed their driveway by way of an emergency access uh, road or route, or it was a paved surface that was installed so that emergency vehicles could get to the back of the subdivision without having to drive all the way through the subdivision to get there. There was a gate along a major road. Nobody got to use it except the emergency access vehicles. But this particular homeowner was using that road to get to their driveway. And so at one point, the county or the homeowners association challenged their right to use that access. And so they filed a claim. The claim was denied because they had a legal right of access. And that was what the insurer insured because their property bounded the public road, which by about 100 feet. So they could have put a driveway in. They had access. They had a legal right of access. So I'm trying to explain this in my motion for summary judgment to the judge. And the judge stops me at one point. He says, and he asked me a question. I answered him. He asked me another question. I answered him. He asked me another question. And finally I said, Judge, you don't understand. And the judge, his face turned beet red. And he looks down at me and screams out, "Are you calling me stupid, counselor?" And I was like, whoa, dude, my heart is pounding out of my chest. I'm like, and I paused for a moment and I said, "I'm sorry, Judge. All I meant to say was, I'm not explaining it very well." And that seemed to placate him. I ended up losing the motion because the guy didn't get it anyway. But if I was a smart aleck like Chris Rock, maybe I would have said, "Of course I am." But I didn't. And I lived to argue another day. Anyways, okay, back to our story. So the dispute with the Wilsons and Smith went on for years. And so the fight was whether the Wilsons had a right to drive across Smith's property to get to their home. The Wilsons filed an action in court. They also sought coverage coverage for the dispute and the cost of litigation and expenses, and the fight went on. So, because the Wilsons obtained a standard owner's policy, the court determined or held that the policy's protection for a right of access meant a legal right of access, not necessarily reasonable access and not necessarily the kind of vehicular access that the Wilsons thought they had purchased. And that's because the parcel touched a public road. So, in other words, what the court said was difficult access doesn't mean you don't have a legal right of access. So now I'm going to stop here because I want you to know not every jurisdiction treats this issue the same way. Okay, so know what the law is in your jurisdiction. Some states hold that what a legal right of access means is a reasonable right of access. Okay, but that's not what the policy is intended to do. So now this story is not about neighbors behaving badly. It's a story about the gap between what buyers think they are buying and what a policy actually ensures. A buyer may believe, I have a driveway and that driveway is my insured access. But the legal question might be, do I have some legal right of access to the land from the public road, even if it's inconvenient, limited, or not the route I expected? So when you're selling or explaining title insurance, don't assume the word access means the same thing to everyone at the table. To the buyer, access may mean the practical ability to drive comfortably to the garage. To a title policy, depending on the policy that is being issued and the facts of the and circumstances, access may mean something narrower, a legal right of access. That difference can decide a claim. It can also decide whether a customer feels informed or blindsided. So here's the broader lesson. Sometimes the issue is not whether the house exists, not whether the deed was recorded, not whether the buyers paid good money. Sometimes the issue is whether the rights needed to use the property the way everyone expects were actually insured the way the buyer assumes. That is why access deserves respect in every transaction. So what can we learn from this story? First, access is an issue worth discussing before closing, not after the fight starts. Second, the standard owner's policy and the homeowner's policy do not describe. Sorry, I'm getting a call. Sorry about that. We are live. Okay, so the standard owner's policy and the homeowner's policy do not describe access the same way. Third, buyers need to understand the difference between a legal right of access and practical access. The law may recognize one even when the other is blocked. And finally, this is where knowledgeable title professionals earn trust, not by oversimplifying, but by explaining the risk clearly enough that a buyer understands what is protected, what may require more investigation, and why the property's apparent access should never be taken for granted. Because sometimes the road to the house is not the same as the right to use it. Okay, that's it for today. I got to get back to my customers. And remember, don't just close it, own it. That's your closing advantage.